The death of the singer George Michael at the age of 53.
George Michael's death is ruled to be due to natural causes, according to a British coroner.
Was Jesus to a child?
At 34 years old, George Michael stood on stage with the weight of a secret pressing down on him. The world saw a superstar, confident, polished, untouchable. But behind the microphone was a man holding back tears. The song he was about to perform wasn't just music, it was a confession. Jesus to a child sounded like a hymn, soft and haunting. But for George, it was something far more personal, an outpouring of grief he had carried in silence for years. Fans would later call it his most beautiful ballad, but George admitted he could barely get through writing it. Every line, every word had been born through tears. What could break a man like George Michael, the golden boy of pop, the voice behind Faith and Careless Whisper, to the point where a song became his only way to survive? The answer lay in a love he kept hidden, a tragedy that nearly destroyed him, and a silence forced on him by a world not yet ready for his truth. And when he finally revealed what this song meant, it shocked even his closest fans, because Jesus to a Child wasn't just about love, it was about loss. It was about the one person George Michael never stopped mourning. But who was that person? And why did George risk his career to sing a song the world wasn't prepared to understand? The truth begins here. You're watching RetroWaves, where the music you love comes alive with the stories you were never told. If you want more untold truths, hidden heartbreaks, and unforgettable moments from the artists who shaped our lives, make sure to hit like, click subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because what you're about to hear about George Michael, you won't find anywhere else. In the mid-1990s, George Michael was at a crossroads. By then, he wasn't just a pop star, he was one of the biggest voices on the planet. From Wham! To Faith, he had sold tens of millions of records, filled arenas, and dominated the charts. To the public, George Michael seemed untouchable. The smooth voice, the boyish looks, the superstar lifestyle. But behind the glamour, George was drifting into silence. He had pulled away from interviews, stopped chasing hits, and was battling a deep loneliness that no one could see. His fans were waiting for his big comeback. The music industry was demanding another chart-topping anthem. But George wasn't writing songs for fame anymore. He was writing because he had no choice. In 1996, he returned with Older, an album that sounded completely different from anything he had done before, darker, more mature, and at the heart of it was Jesus to a Child, a song so raw, so fragile, that it felt like George had ripped a page straight from his soul. But where did it come from? Why did this man who could write perfect pop like Wake Me Up Before You Go suddenly deliver a song filled with grief, longing, and almost unbearable sadness? George himself gave the answer. Jesus to a Child was written after the death of the one person he loved most. It wasn't a casual relationship, it wasn't a fling, it was a love story George had kept hidden from the world. And when tragedy struck, he carried the weight alone. Because in the 1990s, revealing the truth could have destroyed his career, so when he finally stood before his audience and sang those opening words, he wasn't just performing, he was mourning, he was breaking. But who was this person that changed George Michael forever? And why did he choose to finally share the truth through song and not words? Before Jesus to a Child was ever sung, George Michael had already found the love that would inspire it. His name was Anselmo Falepa, a Brazilian fashion designer with a quiet charm and a smile. George later said lit up the room. They met in 1991, when George was performing at the Rock in Rio festival. To the outside world, George was the picture of confidence, striding across the stage, adored by thousands. But when he locked eyes with Anselmo in the crowd, something shifted. For George, it wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. He would later describe it as instant, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. At that time, George was still living in silence. He had not yet come out publicly as gay, and in the early 90s, doing so could risk not only your career, but your safety. Still, with Anselmo, George allowed himself to be vulnerable. They began a relationship that was private, but deeply meaningful. For the first time, George felt the kind of love that was unconditional, grounding, and real. But their happiness would not last long. Only months into their relationship, Anselmo fell ill. He was diagnosed with HIV at a time when the disease was still heavily stigmatized and often seen as a death sentence. George was devastated. He had finally found the love of his life, only to realize their time together might be tragically short. For years, he kept this story to himself. He couldn't speak openly about his relationship. He couldn't tell fans why his music had grown darker or why his smile sometimes faded in interviews. All he could do was hold it inside and wait for the day he could turn his grief into something the world might understand. But no one could have predicted just how soon tragedy would come. By Christmas of 1993, George Michael's world collapsed. Just 2 years after meeting the man he called his soulmate, Anselmo Filippa died from an AIDS-related brain hemorrhage. George was only 30 years old. He had experienced success most people could only dream of, yet in that moment, none of it mattered. The man who had made him feel whole was gone, and George couldn't even grieve openly. To the public, he carried on as a star. But privately, he sank into depression. Friends later revealed that he would sit in silence for hours, unable to write, unable to speak. He described that period as the darkest time in my life. What made it even harder was the secrecy. George hadn't told the world about his relationship with Anselmo. His fans had no idea. The press kept pressing him about his career, about his music, about when he'd release another hit, but George was carrying a grief so heavy, he could barely breathe. Years later, George would admit that his silence was not just personal, it was forced. The music industry of the early 1990s wasn't ready for a superstar to reveal he was gay, and George feared that if he spoke about Anselmo, it would destroy everything he had worked for. So instead of speaking, he wrote quietly, painfully. Line by line, he began crafting a song that would capture his loss, a song that would say everything he couldn't say out loud. That song became Jesus to a Child, but the world didn't know that yet. When George first performed it, audiences were stunned by its beauty, but confused by its meaning. Why was George Michael suddenly singing about sorrow, about love lost, about the fragile passing of time? The answer was buried in his grief, and he was not yet ready to let the world see it, but eventually, he did. And when he told the truth, the story behind the song broke millions of hearts. When George Michael sat down to write again, the music sounded nothing like the pop anthems that had made him famous. There were no catchy hooks, no radio-ready beats. Instead, there was a slow, aching melody that felt almost like a prayer. That melody became Jesus to a Child. George later admitted that the song poured out of him in a way unlike anything else he had written. He described the process as painful, almost unbearable. Each line was stitched together with memories of Anselmo, their laughter, their brief time together, and the devastating silence that followed his death. The lyrics spoke of kindness and joy, but also of fragility and loss. Phrases like, "So the words you could not say, I'll sing them for you," carried the weight of everything George had kept hidden. He was singing not only for himself, but for Anselmo, for the love they had shared, and for the love he could never speak openly about. What made the song even more powerful was that George didn't reveal the full story when it was released. Fans were left to interpret its meaning. Some thought it was about spirituality, others believed it was George reflecting on life itself, but underneath it was a coded love letter, a way for George to finally mourn the man he couldn't acknowledge in public. Years later, George confirmed what many suspected. Jesus to a Child was his tribute to Anselmo. It was his way of keeping his memory alive, of immortalizing a love that had ended far too soon. But even in confessing that truth, George's pain didn't end. Writing the song may have helped him survive, but performing it brought the grief back every single time. And the first time he sang it live, the world saw the cracks in his voice, and they didn't yet know why. On November 20, 1994, George Michael walked onto the stage of the MTV Europe Music Awards in Berlin. It was his first major live performance in years. Fans expected the George they remembered, slick, upbeat, a superstar ready to reclaim his throne. Instead, the lights dimmed, the music began slowly, and George started singing words no one had heard before. "Kindness in your eyes, I guess you heard me cry." The room fell silent. This wasn't the George Michael of faith or father figure, this was something else. His voice carried a weight that made the audience lean in, as if they were being led into a private confession. The performance lasted only a few minutes, but when it ended, people were stunned. The applause was loud, but underneath it was confusion. What was this song? Why did it feel so sad, so haunting, so unlike anything George had ever done? Viewers at home felt the same. This was not the comeback anyone expected. It was raw. It was heartbreaking. It was mysterious. What no one realized that night was that George had just introduced his most personal work, a song born from grief, written for a man whose name he still couldn't say. For George, the performance was both healing and agonizing. On one hand, he had finally shared the song with the world. On the other, he had to do it while still hiding the truth. He couldn't explain who Jesus to a Child was for. He couldn't tell the audience about Anselmo, so he let the song speak for him. And in doing so, he left the world with more questions than answers. But behind the mystery, George was beginning to crack, and soon, the secret behind the song would no longer stay hidden. For years after Anselmo's death, George Michael carried the story in silence. He sang Jesus to a Child again and again, but he never explained it. Fans praised the song for its beauty, critics called it one of his greatest works, yet most listeners didn't realize they were hearing a love letter to a man the world had never known. That changed when George finally decided to tell the truth. In later interviews, he spoke openly about Anselmo for the first time. He described meeting him in Rio as the moment I truly believed in love. He admitted the song was written as a tribute, a way to honor the partner he had lost. And when he said those words, everything clicked into place. Suddenly, lines that once seemed vague became crystal clear. The sorrow, the tenderness, the sense of a life cut short. Fans began listening to the song differently, not as a general ballad about sadness, but as George Michael's most personal confession. George also admitted that writing the song had been excruciating. "I couldn't stop crying," he said, describing the process. Each lyric pulled him back into memories of Anselmo, of their joy, and of the cruel reality of watching him slip away. Although Jesus to a Child was drenched in grief, George Michael always insisted it wasn't only about loss. Beneath the sadness, there was gratitude. He once explained that the song was his way of thanking Anselmo for teaching him what love truly felt like, even if it was brief. Lines like, "So the words you could not say, I'll sing them for you," carried a double meaning. Yes, they were painful, but they were also a promise. George would carry Anselmo's memory forward. The melody itself reflected that balance, slow and mournful, yet filled with warmth. Like a hymn, it was both sorrowful and spiritual. Critics even said it sounded like George was giving a eulogy through song. For George, that was exactly the point. He wanted the world to feel the beauty of the love he lost, even if they never knew the details. He wanted Anselmo's spirit to live inside the music. And in that way, Jesus to a Child became more than just a ballad. It became a monument, a private grief, transformed into something universal. But the song's legacy didn't stop there, because for George Michael, this moment of honesty, even in coded form, marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where he could no longer hide who he was or who he loved. After the release of Older in 1996, George's fans noticed a shift. He was no longer chasing the pop charts with bright, radio-friendly hits. Instead, he was writing music that reflected his real life, his struggles, and his truths. And slowly, the walls he had built around himself began to break down. By the late 1990s, George was more open about his sexuality. He started to speak publicly about his relationships, and eventually, about Anselmo. The secrecy that had once suffocated him gave way to honesty. Looking back, George admitted that Jesus to a Child was the turning point. It was the first time he had allowed himself to be vulnerable in front of the world, even if fans didn't know the whole story at first. It was also the first time he realized that honesty could be powerful, not destructive. Still, the song remained tied to pain. Each performance reminded George of Anselmo's absence. In fact, after the early 2000s, he rarely sang it live, not because it wasn't loved, but because it was too heavy to carry night after night. Yet whenever he did perform it, audiences could feel the difference. This wasn't just a pop star singing a hit. This was a man grieving, remembering, and giving thanks, all in the same breath. And for those who knew the story, it became impossible to hear the song without thinking of Anselmo Felipa. Over time, Jesus to a Child took on a life of its own. It became not just George Michael's tribute, but a comfort for anyone who had lost someone they loved. Listeners began writing to him, sharing how the song helped them through grief, how it felt like George was speaking directly to their pain. That, George once said, was the greatest gift, to take his private heartbreak and turn it into something that healed others. But there was also a darker truth. For George, the song remained a reminder of how cruelly short his happiness with Anselmo had been. In interviews, he confessed that even decades later, he couldn't talk about Anselmo without his voice breaking. It was as if the wound never fully closed, and maybe that's why the song still feels so raw today. It wasn't written to be perfect. It wasn't crafted to climb the charts. It was born in tears and sung in tears. George himself admitted, "I was only able to write it because I was crying so much. Every word came through tears." That confession, made when he was just 34 years old, revealed the full weight behind the song. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't hiding behind metaphors. He meant it literally, and that truth changes the way you hear it forever. Picture George Michael, at 34, finally speaking the words he had kept buried for years. A global superstar, adored by millions, yet broken by a loss he couldn't share until now. When he admitted that Jesus to a Child had been written through tears, it was more than an artistic statement. It was a confession. The pop idol, who once embodied glamour and confidence, was telling the world, "I was grieving, I was fragile, I was broken." Fans were stunned. For decades, George Michael had been larger than life. Yet here he was, admitting that the song they loved was born from the kind of pain most people never see in their idols. And the story didn't end there, because George wasn't just talking about Anselmo, he was talking about what it meant to live in hiding, to love in silence, to lose without comfort. Every time he sang the song, he relived the night he got the call about Anselmo's passing. Every time, he remembered the joy they had shared and the cruel reality of how it ended. And every time, he poured those memories into his voice. That's why no two performances of Jesus to a Child sounded the same. Some nights he sang it with strength. Other nights, his voice cracked under the weight of it. But always, it was real. The climax of the story is this. George Michael gave the world a gift that cost him deeply. He shared the most painful part of his life through music. He risked misunderstanding, judgment, even rejection. But he did it anyway. And that bravery is why the song still resonates today. Because at its core, Jesus to a Child isn't just about George Michael and Anselmo. It's about the universal truth that love, even when it ends in loss, is worth remembering. But what does that mean for the way we remember George Michael himself? When we look back at George Michael's career, it's easy to focus on the hits: Faith, Careless Whisper, Father Figure. But the real measure of his artistry lies in songs like Jesus to a Child, songs that weren't written for fame, but for survival. Through it, George gave us more than a melody. He gave us honesty. He gave us a piece of his soul, and in doing so, he turned private grief into something timeless. For fans, knowing the truth about the song adds a layer of depth. Every lyric becomes sharper, every pause heavier. It's no longer just a ballad. It's George's way of keeping Anselmo alive, of refusing to let love fade into silence. And maybe that's the lesson. Love and loss are inseparable, but if you can carry the memory forward through music, through stories, through the truth, then the person you lost is never truly gone. George Michael died in 2016 at just 53 years old. When fans mourned him, many turned back to Jesus to a Child. Suddenly, the song felt doubled in weight. It wasn't only about Anselmo anymore, it became, in a way, George's own farewell. The music world has never forgotten him, and it never will, because his most painful song became his most powerful gift, and maybe that's what George Michael wanted all along. For the world to finally understand the truth he once had to keep hidden. You've just heard the real story behind George Michael's Jesus to a Child, a song born in tears, built on love, and carried by grief. Now I want to hear from you. When you listen to this song, do you hear only sadness, or do you hear the hope George tried to leave behind? Tell us in the comments, and if you want more hidden truths from the legends of music, make sure to subscribe to RetroWaves, because the stories behind the songs are often more powerful than the songs themselves. By revealing the truth, George took a risk. In the mid-1990s, coming out still carried stigma, especially for someone as famous as him, but he chose honesty. he chose to let the world know that Jesus to a child was not fiction, it was real. And yet, even after confessing, the pain didn't fade. Every time George sang the song, he relived the loss. Audiences heard a ballad. George felt a wound reopening. But there was also something else hidden inside the song, something not everyone noticed at first, a subtle message of hope.